Scott Lewins from UVM Extension will be adding in some information about our Go Scout program, and we'll also be sharing an exciting new research project that Bill Walden has going on at Cornell with powdery mildew. So thanks again, Erin. I'll let you start enlightening us on the wonderful disease of powdery mildew.
Yeah, a fun one. So I'm going to assume you guys can see my my presentation here on powdery mildew of hop. If someone can speak up if that's not the case. Thank you.
I see it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation to come talk to you guys today. We really just started seeing a lot of powdery mildew last year in the field in Michigan. So we'd seen a little bit on baby hop plants, and we'd definitely seen it in the greenhouse, but it really hadn't been something that our growers had been dealing with in the field. So we knew it might happen. We were hoping maybe our weather conditions were going to kind of help us out on the powdery mildew front. But we learned the hard way last year that powdery mildew can do very well in Michigan. And we had quite a few growers that lost their crop in 2017, which was a real heartbreaker. I mean, we're really kind of just coming into commercial production in a lot of our young yards, and so it was a real setback. So powdery mildew can be really damaging, and it's a difficult disease to control, especially on susceptible varieties. Most of our growers in the Great Lakes region don't have powdery mildew on the farm, but it is present in Michigan now, and I know on the East Coast, last I knew it was already documented in Maryland and New York as well. So kind of the bottom line with powdery mildew is that your choice of variety and the source of your plant material are really critical to avoid introducing the pathogen. But of course, once we get the pathogen, then we have to think about management. And so that's really kind of what we're going to focus on today. So I just want to talk a little bit about what happened in 2017 with the Michigan outbreak. There might be some information that you can glean from that. A little bit about the pathogen biology, how to recognize the disease, and then we'll spend a lot of the time talking about management strategies. So in 2017, I started getting some calls from growers in late spring reporting powdery mildew infections, and like any kind of geeky pathologist, I ran right out to see them because we hadn't seen powdery in the field before. So I was pretty surprised when I got to these sites and was able to confirm that yes, it was powdery mildew, not downy mildew. So that's kind of the first step, is making sure that it's actually the right mildew, or that we're talking about the same mildew. And we were seeing infections on leaves in the lower portion of the canopy. So you can see that upper right-hand picture. It's pretty subtle when it first moves in. These are older leaves, but it's certainly something you could drive by pretty easily or walk by without noticing if you weren't looking for that kind of leaf stippling. So it's a little tough to see. We'll have some better pictures later, but there's kind of some white halos around those leaves. If you look closer, they're almost like raised blisters in there. So then as the season progressed and infections worsened, we heard from more and more growers. So my kind of suspicion is probably everybody had those late spring infections in the lower canopy, but maybe a handful actually recognized that it was an issue and reported it. A lot of growers didn't realize they had a problem until, there was really intense infection in the hop yard. So we started looking for the cause. Why are we all of a sudden seeing infection? This was a 4-year-old hop yard, the upper one. So we wouldn't expect to just all of a sudden start to see kind of epidemic levels of powdery mildew. And the only thing that was in common between all of the farms that had infections in 2017 is they all had baby hop plants on site. And they also had little or no powdery mildew fungicides in rotation. So most of the fungicides that we use for downy mildew management are not effective at powdery mildew management. They're certainly not kind of the premium or excellent level powdery materials that we want. Some provide a little bit of suppression for the most part. And so, you know, right away we started to think, well, what we're probably seeing are infections that were carried from the propagator to the field and caused these infections on, you know, essentially in hop yards that had been clean for the last 4 years. So powdery mildew, like a lot of diseases, is easily spread on infected plants, foliage, or crown buds of dormant plants even. So, you know, whether you're using rhizomes or plantlets, you can still get both powdery and downy from the propagator. Weather conditions that favor mildew include low light levels, so kind of cloud cover, canopy density, so high canopy density where we're kind of the relative humidity is kept higher, excessive fertility and or high soil moisture. So when you really look at those things combined, or those environmental factors combined, they're really plant stressors, right? So in disease management, the number one thing they talk about is keep your plant out of stress. That's a great way. Of course, it's really hard to do those things when the stress can be caused by environmental factors like these. Dew or rain does not play as big of a role in powdery mildew like it does in downy mildew. This is one of the reasons we were hoping we might see less powdery kind of in our more rain-prone regions in the Northeast. But it does result in high humidity and cloud cover, which does favor disease. So they're kind of connected. So in 2017, you can see I pulled some weather station data to look at what our temperature range was. You know, it was really just ideal conditions for a powdery mildew outbreak. And frankly, most of the time, you know, our spring and even summer weather is pretty conducive to powdery mildew. So a little bit about the pathogen itself. Powdery mildew is a disease that's caused by Podosphaera macularis. It's a fungal disease, and it can cause complete crop loss. It's associated with a number of secondary pathogens, and secondary pathogens are things that typically don't cause disease on the hop plant alone, but when you combine them with something like a powdery mildew infection, they can exacerbate kind of the symptoms and the issues that you see. So a lot of times when we culture out cones that are showing an infection from powdery or downy, we'll find things like Fusarium and Alternaria associated with those infections. And of course, powdery mildew can also affect post-harvest quality. So we'll show you some pretty heavily infected cones later, but even cones that aren't showing a lot of visual symptoms of infection have reduced alpha acid levels and a reduced top storage index. So powdery mildew overwinters as mycelia, which is just the fungal threads that the fungus makes up, kind of the fungal body inside the buds. Shoots emerging from infected buds form what are known as flag shoots that become covered with white spore masses. So they look pretty stunted and distorted. We'll see some pictures of those. They're very rare, so the initial inoculum comes from less than 1% of shoots that are infected. And a lot of the pictures of flag shoots out there are like these bright white large flag shoots. Well, more commonly, they're actually quite subtle and pretty difficult to visualize or to walk through and scout for. The spore masses on those flag shoots are conidia. They spread to adjacent healthy tissue and cause new infections. And then that infection cycle continues throughout the season. So there is a sexual phase of this fungi as well. It requires 2 mating types. And under those conditions, they can form these resting spores or ascospores that can also be present in the spring. In Michigan, we've only found multiple mating types on feral hop plants. So we haven't yet found 2 mating types within an individual hop yard, which is really good news for the grower. So when we have this kind of asexual phase of the fungi, it's an obligate parasite, which means when you cut down infected plant material, that fungus dies along with the plant. So it has to be in a living host to survive and persist. The sexual phase presents this resting spore that can then overwinter. It can be on plant debris, you know, so it kind of can persist longer and through periods of drought or cold and things like that. So in the case of sexual spores being produced, you can actually see them on the leaf surface. So you'll see kind of the white fungal colonies, and then within those there'll be little kind of black pepper flecks, and those are those resting spores that are being developed. Again, we haven't seen those in commercial hop yards in Michigan. So this is just a graphic of what the cycle looks like. So it overwinters in or on crown buds. Then when that bud breaks in the spring, we can have some of them that develop into flag shoots. So this would be bearing those spores called conidia. Those are the asexual spores. Those are chains of spores. They break off, infect leaf tissue, they can infect cones, they can infect the shoot itself, and then those also create more conidia and spore chains. And so that cycle repeats itself over and over within the season. And this is important later when we talk about delaying the onset of management. So or delaying the onset of disease rather. So you can imagine if you can slow the initial infection from occurring, you would have less of these cycles within the season. And then here they show what happens, when they have sexual recombination with the multiple mating types, and that really can exacerbate and change the way we manage. But right now we're managing based on just having the conidia and having that asexual phase present. So I think I already talked about most of this. I did want to talk a little bit about, move this out of the way. Sorry, I don't know why that popped up. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the information that you might hear from other people. So there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about powdery mildew. I think one of the reasons people have misconceptions is because we see powdery mildew on all different plants, right? So if you have lilacs, if you have roses, if you have cucumbers, you see powdery mildew. I just want to be clear that those are different species of powdery mildew. Most mildews do not move from species to species. They're very species specific. They're obligate parasites, right? They tend to be more species specific. So it didn't come from, the cucumbers in your neighbor's garden. It doesn't blow in on the wind. Infections likely come from baby hop plants with existing infections that are moved onto farm. There's quite a bit of evidence for that. There's been some genetic testing that's been done by David Gent, who's the USDA ARS researcher. He's really kind of the world expert on powdery. And one of the things they look for is, okay, what's the mating type? What's kind of the genetic fingerprint? And what they found from the isolates in Michigan was that they were related back to essentially a genetic individual that originated in the Pacific Northwest. So probably that was brought in on plant material and then propagated out and then spread to the yard. So if we were seeing like genetic recombination and things blowing around a lot, if these were natural infections from feral hops where we see both mating types, we would expect to see both mating types within the commercial yards as well. So there's a lot of evidence that says, probably the, easiest explanation is the correct explanation. So here we see a picture of a flag shoot. Again, it appears in the spring as a white stunted shoot, less than 1% of shoots. So in yards that experienced high infection levels last year, it's still less than 1% of the shoots that emerge as flag shoots. In yards that didn't have high infection, so moderate to low infection, it's something like 0.05 percentage of 1% are infected flag shoots, so it's very low. Again, as leaf tissue expands, you see new lesions forming. I think in this picture you can see a little more how that leaf is puckered and kind of blistered looking. And then on the upper leaf surface where those blisters occur, you'll start to see the formation of those white spore-bearing structures. So those are those chains of conidial spores that are going to move off-site and create new infections. Here's kind of an up-close image to give you an idea of what that powdery looks like. This is opposed to downy mildew, which we would find on the lower leaf surface, and it would be kind of black or gray in color. So they are pretty easy to tell apart. Another picture of those lesions developing or continuing to develop on on leaf material. This is what cone infection looks like. So infected burrs and cones can also support that white fungus, or sometimes they actually just exhibit a reddish discoloration. So they don't always produce the spore masses that you see there. A big factor in what cone infection looks like is when cone infection takes place. And just like in general, earlier cone infections produce worse symptoms. You can actually see this cone is really almost aborted based on infection at burr stage. So let me explain this better. The pictures along the top are kind of the different developmental stages of the hop from, burr stage up through harvest. If infection occurs at each of these stages, the cones below are the resulting impact. So you can see as the cones get older, the impact is less. And so again, we definitely want to make sure that we're covering the cones at these early stages and that we're delaying the onset of infection as long as possible. So powdery mildew management requires multiple tactics. We're going to really focus on how we can delay the onset of disease development. We'll talk about sourcing clean plant material, variety selection, so what's most susceptible, pruning and canopy management, fungicide application, and harvest timing. So a little bit about clean plant material. I think it's really important to source from propagators who are being inspected by their State Department of Ag, who are utilizing the Clean Plant Network. But I think it's also important for you to consider ordering a small lot of plants, getting them tested for virus and other pathogens like downy and powdery, at your university testing facilities. Talking to other growers about their experiences with propagators is really important. So I think one of the misconceptions is that if your vendor or your propagator is inspected by your Department of Ag in your state, that means they're clean plants, or that if they source their mother plants from the Clean Plant Network, that they're providing clean plants. So the Clean Plant Network essentially produces cuttings for people to utilize, kind of a mother plant. I think they're actually tissue culture plants they send out. And they have a list of viruses that they guarantee are not in that plant material. They do not guarantee any other cleanliness on the part of that plant. Additionally, once your propagator gets it, their practices in the greenhouse are really going to affect how clean the plants are that you receive. So they're taking cuttings from that mother plant, but they could be overwintering them outside or, doing kind of poor management practices that could expose them to pathogens and other issues. Additionally, in terms of your State Department of Ag coming in and inspecting, when you have unhealthy plant tissue that's infected with powdery and downy, you can cut those plants back and you'll get a flush of new growth that looks healthy. I don't know what the standards are in your various states, but I would look into that before relying too heavily on your state inspection. In Michigan, they simply do a visual inspection. So if that propagator knows they have an issue, they're pretty readily able to kind of manipulate the appearance of the plants before inspection occurs. So just to let you know that kind of these different processes are important, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get clean plant material. So again, getting plants tested that you order a small lot of is important, talking to other growers, and then looking at your overall plant health upon delivery. So this is a picture of some plants that were delivered to a farmer, and they sent me a picture of this. If I was walking through a greenhouse to select plants, I would never pick this tray, right? We're seeing a lot of issues with this tray of plants. There were pictures of poor root growth. Here you can see in this picture, obviously there was almost anaerobic-like conditions, way too much moisture, maybe too much fertilizer, poor fine root development, a number of issues. I think as growers, we need to be inspecting these plants and rejecting poor quality plants and not accepting them. Other symptoms of mismanagement could include things like the presence of a lot of mites or aphids or other issues that should be controlled in the greenhouse. So just another indicator of plant health and a way to help you make your decision and hopefully prevent kind of, you know, taking on plants that are already set back and starting you kind of behind the start line. So variety selection is also important. A number of the hop varieties have been looked at in terms of their susceptibility to diseases, including powdery and downy mildew. Of course, the number one driver for production of variety is market at this point, but we definitely have to balance that with susceptibility. I think it's also important to look, obviously, at downy mildew susceptibility, and particularly if you're trying to do a reduced input or organic type production system, you're just simply not going to be able to produce these susceptible or moderately susceptible varieties, you know, with these disease challenges. I think in some years, even the moderately resistant or those that are considered resistant could be an issue. So resistance can break down with, depending on the type of mating types that you have and the crosses being made. So it's not something that we can 100% rely on over time. So canopy management, there's kind of two forms of canopy management we're going to talk about. The first being pruning. So a lot of growers do early spring pruning in the Pacific Northwest. It hasn't been something that we have regularly done in Michigan. We've really just started doing this on the larger farms over the last couple of years. And then I think most of our growers are adopting it this season because of the issues with powdery mildew that we had last year. And pruning is really kind of a catch-all phrase. It includes crowning, scratching, so kind of these different levels of pruning. And it also helps synchronize growth, right? So we're looking to synchronize that first flush of growth for optimal yield, characteristics like we want our cones to all be ready for harvest at the same time. So there's other benefits, obviously, to pruning. It also removes plant remnants from the previous season. It can eliminate infected crown buds that have powdery and downy mildew inoculum. It's not recommended on babies. So obviously with babies, they have a limited root reserve. They're just trying to push the tops, and we're trying to produce essentially crown area. So for the first 2, maybe 3 years, if you're dealing with weaker plants or kind of had a late start, we wouldn't recommend pruning. Late winter, early season pruning can reduce inoculum. Mechanical pruning has been found to be more effective than chemical pruning in eliminating flag shoots or cone infection. So chemical pruning out west is typically done with paraquat and AIM. In Michigan, we're limited. We don't have access to paraquat, so we're using AIM for our chemical pruning. And we often find with AIM, we need 2 applications to adequately knock it back. So, you know, that comes into play with late springs and getting our training date, late May. So it can be an issue. Producers can sometimes, again, follow up to make sure things are cleaned up really well. Growers who crown, which is, you know, when you're really shaving the top off of that mound, typically have hilled up soil on the crowns in the previous growing season. So when you look at hilling, it can look, or I'm sorry, crowning, it can look quite extreme. If you're not piling up soil, you're probably doing more of a scratch, which is you're just trying to rub off those crown buds on the top and clean things up. Less aggressive mechanical pruning methods such as scratching don't require annual hilling. It's important to consider that viruses can be spread to adjacent plants through mechanical transmission. So it's kind of the weighing the pros and cons, right? So mechanical pruning has been shown to be more effective at mildew disease control, but it's also a bigger risk for viral spread than using a chemical desiccant. So here you see kind of a picture of pruning done with a chemical desiccant. It's recommended that you prune as late as possible. The reason for that is, again, we're trying to delay the onset of infection. So the later we let those inoculum-bearing flag shoots come out, the better. It's also 1 or maybe even 2 less fungicide applications for producers. Of course, grower preference, farm system, and experience all impact whether you choose to use a chemical desiccant for pruning or if you're going to go mechanical. And then for people who have permanent drip lines in place, things like that, you know, it can be pretty difficult to deal with crowning. So this is some data I wanted to share that really helps illustrate the importance of when initial disease occurrence takes place. So over here you have the proportion, or kind of the percentage of plants with mildew infection. And then along the x-axis is kind of date and time. So when you look at the end of the season and say, wow, we had a ton of infection, you know, on farms where infection occurred in April and May at quite high numbers. So this is, you know, whatever, 10% by May were infected. They saw really high infection levels by the end of the season. In places where they were able to delay the onset of disease into June, much lower rates of infection. So just another way to illustrate, you know, how important it is to delay the onset of infection, which we do through pruning and also through fungicide application. Canopy management involves basically desiccating the lower 3 feet or so of the understory in the hopyard. This is done after the hop vines are far enough up the coir that the growing point will not be affected, that it's got enough leaf tissue out there to photosynthesize effectively. And also we talk a lot about bark hardening or vine hardening. You know, when you're training those shoots, they're really succulent and green. At this stage of the season, you should start to see a kind of barky, corky look to that stem. That's when it's ready for AIM application. So we do see AIM speckling and damage on tender young vines. And we, again, would not do this on baby hops because they need kind of all that photosynthetic area to develop that crown. Most growers are going to do this 2 or 3 times within the season. This is really just to increase airflow around the crown, make it less hospitable to disease development. Here you can see it when it's kind of even more cleaned up, really stripped down. So moving on to fungicide treatments, they should begin immediately after either shoot emergence if you're not going to prune, or regrowth. So we typically say about 6 inches of growth is when we want to start doing fungicide applications. If you get to 6 inches and you're going to come through and prune, then you don't need to put a fungicide down. And that's of course because this is an obligate parasite. So when we remove that tissue, we remove the risk of infection. Different fungicides are utilized for powdery mildew control during 3 distinct periods, from emergence, mid-June to bloom, and then bloom to pre-harvest. So I don't want to spend a ton of time kind of going through these specific recommendations, except to say early on we talk a lot about using oils. They're less expensive for growers. These are not cheap fungicide programs. That's what they've used in the Pacific Northwest with a lot of pressure, and it's worked out quite well for them. We also recommend tank mixing oils in copper with some of these other products for resistance management purposes, and it also kind of gives your efficacy a bump. Mid-June to bloom, we kind of transition out of those oils, coppers, kind of those basics, and now we're applying what are really highly effective fungicides. And then bloom to harvest, Quintec comes in there. You know, we have to obviously mind the pre-harvest interval at that time of the season. So I've kind of listed the pre-harvest interval there for you in terms of making decisions. Mid-July through early August, which is, you know, during burr to cone development, is a really essential disease management period. So we looked at those pictures of the cones and how symptoms progressed quickly when burrs or early stages of cone development were infected. So Quintec is really critical during that period of cone development. That's shown really good efficacy. And then just to note that the powdery mildew pathogen is at high risk of developing fungicide resistance. So I did want to touch just on fungicide resistance briefly to help you kind of maintain the efficacy of products on the farm as well as regionally. So pesticide resistance describes the decreased susceptibility of a pest, in this case powdery mildew, to a pesticide that was previously effective. And I kind of have this little diagram here. So if these dots are all of the powdery mildew pathogen isolates in your field, And all the blue ones are susceptible to, say Luna sensation that you're going to put on. And this red one is not susceptible. When we make a pesticide application, we essentially kill the vast majority of those blue fungal isolates. The red one survives to undergo a reproductive cycle, and then it starts to appear at higher frequencies in the pathogen population. And if we apply that same pesticide like Luna, we again select for those red ones, and over time that frequency increases and increases. If we had switched it up and selected or utilized a different fungicide, maybe Quintec, these would likely no longer be resistant. So it would take multiple kind of spontaneous mutations to occur at that time point to allow that to happen. So more than likely that Quintec is going to kill those Luna resistant isolates. And so you're kind of constantly turning over and utilizing different selection pressures essentially. So one of the easy ways to manage for resistance is to rotate mode of action, which is really what we just talked about, right? Moving from Luna to Quintec. And fungicide or distributors are really making it easier for us now. On the labels at the top, there are group codes which denote the mode of action. So you can say, okay, these are the ones I have, these are the modes of action. I don't ever want to follow my Luna sensation with another group 7 or 11 fungicide. So Luna happens to be a premix that contains 2 fungicides, fluopyrim and trifloxystrobin, but it's like it's kind of the crib notes for reading the pesticide resistance management. And actually most of the insecticides and herbicides have those as well. Lastly, harvest timing. It's recommended not to let cones hang longer than necessary, so we tend to see more disease in late harvested cones. And then consider early harvest if disease is present. So we talked about that with some of our growers last year, about getting those cones off just as quickly as possible, even a little earlier than they'd like, because there was so much inoculum on the farm. So just in review, for powdery management, that clean planting material is really where we need to start out. Even if you have a neighbor who is powdery and it's going to move in eventually, boy, those establishment years, you want that plant growing the best it can. Variety selection, pruning and canopy management, this is really new, so it's definitely going to be some kind of trial and error to figure those details out. Fungicides are going to be really critical. We're on a 7 to 10 day application schedule in Michigan once those plants are 6 inches or taller all the way through harvest. And usually we get a couple post-harvest applications on as well. And then lastly, harvest timing. Again, just not letting those cones hang any longer than we have to. So with that kind of concludes my presentation.
Great. Thanks, Erin. That was really scary, but very educational.
Yes.
And, hopefully you haven't gotten any calls this year. Have you heard anything yet about powdery mildew in Michigan?
No, but we're just, coming into training time for the most part. I mean, some of the kind of weaker varieties and in southern Michigan have been trained, but it's still so early. And those flag shoots are such a small percentage of what comes up. I feel like it's very insidious because it gives you a false sense of security.
Well, good. I mean, it's something we all want to be on the, in front of instead of getting that surprise like you folks did. So that was definitely one of the reasons we were inviting you to join us, so we could have our eyes peeled.
Yeah.
So Amanda is going to launch a quick poll right now. There's 2 questions, and for the folks in the audience, if you wouldn't mind answering those questions, it just helps us gauge if the webinar is useful and helping folks. That would be great. And then if you could also start typing questions into the Q&A box that you might have, that would be wonderful. And so let's get those quick polls answered. Yes, I'm answering yes. It's not letting me answer. Oh, it says I can't vote. Okay, never mind. Everybody else vote. And then get some questions into the Q&A box. I'm sure folks have questions. Amanda, you can let me know when people have answered the quick poll. And I think what we're gonna do, Erin, as people are getting questions in, we're gonna let Bill Weldon, he's a graduate student at Cornell. He's going to tell us about his powdery mildew project that he has going on, and he's out there looking for the disease and looking for some participants. So I'm gonna turn it over to Bill for a minute so he can announce that, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. So Bill, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Let me exit full screen and try and share just a couple little PowerPoint slides that I
Okay, that would be great.
So let's see, I will share screen. I'll share this.
All right, super.
Did that pop up okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
So can you put it into full screen mode? Because right now it's in the, yep.
How's that look?
Yep, great.
Okay, awesome.
We'll let you
Yeah,
go
so
ahead and
this
start.
kind of falls really closely in line with everything that Erin was talking about. But just to introduce myself, my name is Bill Weldon, and I'm a third-year graduate student at Cornell. My advisor is David Gadori, and actually Dave Jent, the researcher at Oregon State and USDA Corvallis, is on my committee as well for graduate students. So I'm like to think that I'm very in tune with a lot of the powdery mildew research that's going on around the country. And one of the projects that is a part of my PhD thesis is a population study where, kind of with what Erin was talking about with the different mating types of powdery mildew or different genders, and then also just the different isolates, the different strains that have shown either resistance to specific varieties of hops or resistance to certain fungicides. These are all things that we're hoping to continue to track with this project. Erin mentioned that Dave, the Gent Lab's done a lot of sample collection in the past. That's given us kind of a good understanding of where isolates have come from in the past. And now my sample collection in collaboration with Dave is now kind of moving forward, and we're trying to track in real time the distribution of some of these powdery mildew populations around the country. And so, like Erin was talking about, these three pictures that I have on my screen, I have just some powdery mildew on the left, but then the white fluffy state of powdery mildew is, you'll see that when you only have one mating type there. And that's your predominant state that you're going to see in the growing season. But like Erin was talking about, it also has this resting spore that can form. And that only forms when you have both mating types there. And so we've developed genetic tools to be able to figure out what mating types are present in the Hopyard. And so one of the things I'm hoping to do with this project is generate just a geographic distribution of where the mating types are present around the country in commercial hopyards, and also in wild or feral hop plantings as well, because it really kind of is informative on how the growers manage the disease, knowing whether they have this resting spore potentially forming towards the end of their growing season, should they encounter powdery mildew that season. So one thing that we're trying to look to track is the distribution of mating types, but then we also have some molecular genetic fingerprints associated with potential fungicide resistance. And so we're trying to be on the forefront of tracking whether there's any risk for fungicide resistance popping up in powdery mildew populations. And the way we're trying to address that is through really kind of intensive sampling of any powdery mildew that's popping up around the country. So that's why I'm trying to be really proactive, and we really need your guys' help just in getting samples collected once, or if and when they appear out in the field, because it really kind of helps us get an understanding and helps you guys determine how you're going to manage the disease within your hopyard. So the sampling protocol is really pretty simple. If you suspect or find powdery mildew in your yard, it would be great if you could email me immediately, and it would ideally be before applying any chemical control if possible. And we can get sample collection materials out to you that next day. And we can also kind of provide some help in terms of deciding what control measures to take as well. But yeah, it'd be great if you can get in touch before taking any sort of chemical control measures, so that we can get samples collected. We overnight ship to you, and essentially we're just going to send you a strip of stickers that you just take one of they're just little circular stickers. You can see one kind of on the right here in the tube. You just take one of those off. You identify distinct powdery mildew colonies on the leaves. So like this one has, you can see it clearly has a distinct margin. It's one distinct colony, which means that it's one isolate. And you just use the sticker, peel it off the surface of the leaf, and then place it into a tube. And we're asking that, if possible, to collect at least 12 samples from your yard. So that way we can start to get a good understanding of what the distribution is of any sort of different isolates or different mating types that are in the yard. And if those samples could be distributed kind of evenly throughout the area of your affected hop plants, that'll give us a good sense of what's going on in your yard specifically. For the purpose of the study, all of the grower-specific information will remain confidential, so we're going to do anything to divulge the fact that your yard has powdery mildew. We're just using this as kind of a larger scale geographic scope of the distribution of powdery mildew. But we do submit samples. We're going to be kind of doing all of this analysis with a pretty quick turnaround throughout the summer. And so I will follow up with you and be able to let you know what we found in your yard. So I guess the primary deliverable would be telling you how many mating types are present in your yard. So whether you should be concerned about having that overwintering spore in your yard, which would be informative for how you prepare to manage powdery mildew the following season, should you find it in your yard this year. But the larger goals of the study, like I said, are just to create a map of the distribution of the mating types across the country. Only one mating type is present in the Pacific Northwest. And so we're also trying to figure out how close that second mating type is to getting into the major hop producing part of the country. But we also want to know kind of the distribution of mating types across the East Coast, because it has direct implications on how you guys manage the disease as well. We also have these tools that we can start to take the first steps towards monitoring for development of fungicide resistance in hop powdery mildew populations. So we have some molecular genetic fingerprints that for other powdery mildews, like powdery mildew on grape, have been kind of, they infer genetic or fungicide resistance is popping up in the populations, and we can now take those and use them in hop powdery mildew and try and track for the same things. And then also monitor for the presence of races of hop powdery mildew that are particularly virulent on specific varieties. So out in the Pacific Northwest, 2 varieties that have strains of hop powdery mildew that are kind of adapted for those 2 varieties are Nugget and Cascade. And so that's something that we want to be on the lookout for, the kind of introduction of either of those aggressive isolates into any of the eastern hop producing regions. And then, yeah, just the bigger picture is just getting a better understanding of how these factors are distributed across the country. And these have direct implications on how we manage hop powdery mildew here on the East Coast. So your expected efficacy of specific fungicides, and also your expected initial disease pressure at the beginning of each growing season. Because if you know that both mating types are present in your yard, you're going to have to be concerned about that overwintering spore being in your yard, which could presumably kind of infer that you're going to be starting out with a higher disease pressure that following season. So I hope I don't get very many samples, but I also appreciate all of your help in kind of getting this collection effort going, if at all possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. As Heather mentioned, we've got about 15 minutes left, and this is an opportunity for you folks to ask either Erin questions about downy mildew management, or if you want to ask Bill more questions about his project. This is a great opportunity too. So again, on the bottom right, there's a Q&A section. Just go ahead and type your questions in, and we will put them to our panelists. So we've already got a couple of questions here. And the first one from Terry, who's in Northern New York. She's a second-year grower. Says, haven't used any fungicides. What would you recommend to start with? I think this one is for you, Erin.
Yeah, so you're going to be, you know, really treating for 2 different diseases, and I can talk about them here. I did write up a hop disease management article, which you can find at hops.msu.edu, so don't feel like you have to write all of this down. But I think in general, you're probably looking to have, you know, 3 powdery specific fungicides at a minimum, and 3 downy specific fungicides at a minimum. The backbone of what we use for downy in Michigan is like Ranman, Zampro, Curazate. And then for all those products, we are using copper or potentially oil to supplement them or as tank mix partners. So, you know, maybe for downy you'd have, or for powdery you'd have like Flint, Quintec, Luna Experience or something like that on farm. So what I would recommend is look at that disease management article and talk to your pesticide vendor and see what they have available that kind of either has the same active ingredient and is labeled on hops. Look at the price list before you make that decision. So those are going to be kind of important considerations based on what you can source. And then also, of course, making sure that they're labeled in New York State. New York, Hawaii, California are states that commonly have different regulations in terms of what's labeled for use. So I'm pretty hesitant to make fungicide recommendations without, you know, obviously you checking them, and you have great people at Cornell as well who can help you with those. So I hope that's kind of helpful anyway.
Yes, and Terry says thank you. Timothy asks, can mildew, and I'm assuming he's referring to powdery, but you might know the answer for downy as well, live on hopcorn beam, hardhack, ironwood, nearby tree stands?
Nope. So both downy and powdery only infect Humulus lupulus. Ostrea virginiana is actually a tree species that hopcorn beam wouldn't see any infection. So you might see powdery symptoms of a different mildew species, but they would not harbor the hop powdery or downy mildew.
Great, Erin. Thank you. Again, if you have questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box, and we will put them to our panelists. Bill, there was a question about how to get a hold of you, and I believe you shared your email address, and so I will share that again. So just confirm that if a grower does find powdery mildew, they email you, and then you immediately send them out the pack. Is that correct?
Yep, that's so my email address is www.395@cornell.edu. It's on the first slide, which this is being recorded, so that'll get posted out as well.
Yeah, and I will share that email address again. Thank you, Bill.
Awesome, thank you, Scott. But yeah, once I get that email, I will immediately send something out that same day, just overnight in the mail. It'll just be basically 12 tubes and a bunch of stickers and an envelope, and maybe a pair of tweezers for you to. But I'll get that out immediately, so that, and then we can also talk with my advisor and kind of get some help in terms of deciding how management they'll do as well, if you want to talk about that. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again. So at this point, there aren't any other questions about powdery mildew management. Actually, as soon as I said that, another one just popped up. John asks, any idea when this will be posted? And our plan is to post these webinars shortly after they are recorded, and we will follow that that plan for today. So our goal is, again, at some point this afternoon. Generally, we get these power hours posted to our YouTube channel shortly after they air live, if we have permission from the presenter. And unfortunately, at this point, we're still working to get permission from the Canadian government to share last month's power hour. So stay tuned to our YouTube channel for that. But again, this power hour will be posted to our YouTube channel, so that you can watch it again if you would like. There were a number of questions about downy mildew management on our most recent Go Scout. Erin, do you feel like comfortable to answer some of those questions?
Give it a shot here.
All right, so I'm assuming that this is the case, but there was a question about downy mildew and weather conditions, and I think you mentioned it briefly in your discussion of powdery mildew management, but can you just briefly go through again, what are those weather conditions that are conducive to downy mildew, and how is that different than powdery mildew?
Yeah, so, wet, humid conditions, downy mildew actually will germinate so the spores will germinate and be quite active at pretty low temperatures. So it's pretty interesting when you look at the model they developed for predicting risk of downy infection in the Pacific Northwest. And they use that to gauge when they need to intensively manage and things like that. When you plug in weather data from Michigan, it's red. It's awful high risk essentially the entire season. So in the Pacific Northwest, they'll see risk shut down because of dry, intensely hot weather that we rarely see in the Great Lakes region or in the northeastern United States. So based on their parameters, which, we might be able to develop a model that kind of is able to delineate between rainfall or relative humidity or, some of these different factors. But based on their model developed in what is essentially a high desert, we're always in kind of a high risk zone for downy mildew development.
Awesome. Another question, Erin. Are there carryover effects into the following growing season? Again, talking about downy mildew, not powdery mildew, was the question was originally asked.
Yep, absolutely. So actually a lot like the powdery mildew life cycle, that fungus overwinters in the plant. So when we see systemic infections occur, which of course are going to occur more regularly in highly susceptible varieties, as well as under conditions of, a lot of disease, then we see higher incidence of, in this case, so they're called flag shoots. In powdery mildew, we call them spikes. In downy mildew, we see higher spike incidence the next year with downy, which is kind of nice because then you know what you're dealing with. With powdery, very few flag shoots. Again, really hard to tell what you're in for that season. So I think with downy, we usually have an idea if we're in trouble early on, and we can keep tissue covered and actually be pretty successful in managing downy even when we see quite large carryover. So
All right, great. Bill, I wonder if there's a specific geographic region that you're targeting, or we have most of our participants are in the Northeast. We have a bunch from Canada, and we have a bunch from the Midwest. And so are you accepting samples from a wide geographic region, or are you targeting any particular narrow region?
Nope, I'm accepting samples from all over the country, basically. So anywhere in the United States or Canada is totally fair game for this study. And even commercial plantings, or I've gotten emails in the past from people that have come across Hopyard mildew on wild hops, or like a wild Japanese hop that they cannot be found growing along creeks and stuff. But that is also fair game for the study, and that's also informative for stuff that Erin was talking about in terms of figuring out where the powdery mildew that gets into your yard is actually coming from. Is it coming from a wild planting source, or is it coming in on some of the hop seedlings that maybe you purchased when you're initially starting your yard? So yeah, that's all fair game, and I'm sending a plethora of emails to basically anybody I can get in touch to. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. Can you guys, yes, you can see my screen now. So we have a couple of minutes left, and it doesn't appear as though there are any other questions for Bill or Erin. So again, I want to thank you guys. And what I did was put Bill's email address up on the screen again for you guys. Again, if you have any concern, go ahead and contact him immediately, and he'll send you out that packet to get your sample sent into him. I
Hey, Scott,
have.
can I pop in with one more thing?
Please do.
Sure. It's actually in regards to downy mildew. It's something that Dave Gent and I put together recently, trying to kind of update the list, or the varieties that are resistant to downy mildew and susceptible and whatnot. And so just kind of ascribing varietal resistance to downy mildew is tough, because downy mildew can reduce the yield that you get from your plant, but it also can reduce, or it can kill your cones, but it also can reduce the yield from year to year. And so maybe you get downy mildew and your plants just don't come back quite as strong the following year. And so that's one way that downy mildew could affect the plants, but then it also can just grow on the leaf tissue and cause those cones to not be suitable for brewing. So there's kind of two ways that downy mildew can have an impact. And some varieties, their yield is kind of greatly reduced when they're infected with downy. So the crown, and they start to die over the years, but they're not quite as are susceptible on the foliar side of things. And then there's some varieties that are super susceptible. Their cones are super susceptible, but they don't really get affected on the yield side of things. And so I was wondering, we put together a little article kind of trying to better ascribe resistance, taking into account kind of those two things. And so I was wondering if I could share a screen of that article and also post a link to where it is.
Yeah, what you can do, Bill, is if you send that link to us, we'll put it up on our Hops page, which I'm showing right
Sure.
now. So what you
Okay.
folks can see is the Hops page for UVM extension. It has all our previous Power Hour recordings that are up on YouTube, including the presentation from Dave Gent last year on downy mildew. And so we will add, Bill, that link to this page.
Awesome.
There were some questions on the last Go Scout about downy mildew management and how to identify spikes that Erin was referring to. And so again, I'll just point you to, there's a fact sheet here on our website about downy mildew management, in addition to this Power Hour specifically on downy mildew from last year that David Gent shared with us. I saw there was one more question. No, maybe not. So the last thing that folks were asking about on the Power Hour, on the Go Scout, someone had asked about hilling. And so what I want to do is maybe put that question off to our next presenter. So Jean Latoile from 4 Star Farms will be giving a grower's perspective for the next Power Hour. That's June 25th at noon. And so I know down at 4 Star, they do their version of hilling. And so I'm sure he can help to share some of their wisdom about hilling, as well as some of the other things that they've been doing down there. And it is just about 1 o'clock. And I don't know if Heather is still able to chime in, but I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this Power Hour. Again, our Power Hours that are recorded are available on our YouTube channel, as well as a lot of the other topics that we're covering. Heather, do you want to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody, Erin and Bill, for joining us. And if you do have specific questions that you need addressed right away, or you're wondering about something you're seeing in your yard, please don't hesitate to send us an email or give us a call too. We're happy to answer questions outside of the Power Hour. So thank you again, and have a great week. It looks like nice weather in Vermont.